Okay.
Hey, Jonathan, this is Sumita.
Hey, how are you?
Good. Well, I'm so glad that you made time to talk with us today. Let me introduce myself for everyone. My name is Sumita Jonak, and I'm president of the Healthcare Alumni Association of Anderson. And Jonathan, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Sure. Well, I'm a board member for the Healthcare Alumni Association, but I think the reason that we're chatting today is I am a managing director at Brown Gibbons Lang, one of the country's leading investment banking platforms, and I'm one of the senior bankers in their healthcare M&A team.
Yeah, and it's amazing what you do because you're always traveling, you're, living the banker's life. But you find a way to have balance and you find a way to, build your career and still have time to volunteer on this board with us. In fact, you just held a wonderful event this past Monday that had a great turnout. So I'm really curious, just looking through your background, how you got here, what was your journey like?
Yeah, well, one of the reasons why it's so important to me to be involved with the board here, the Alumni Association for Healthcare Executives at Anderson, is that throughout my career, I've had tremendous mentors, and I'd like to figure out ways to give back to the next generation. And it all started first out of college some 25 years ago. I didn't start in investment banking. I started in consulting. I did a lot of process redesign, workflow automation, tool selection for health systems, for payers, for multi-specialty provider groups all over the country. My first job was with a company called APM, American Practice Management, and even in those days, I was guided and mentored by some senior executives who took me under their wing, shared recommendations for roles and functions I should strive for because they could help me advance, could give me really good learning experience, suggested extracurricular activities that I could get involved with in the office so that I could have FaceTime with some of the more influential senior executives. And I've been so fortunate to have those experiences while learning the fundamentals of the early days of what we called revenue cycle redesign and some of the different process work that we did. I also learned a lot about how important it was early in my career to have coaching and mentorship, and that's been important to me ever since.
That's a fantastic way to start. And, I want to dig into a little bit about the coaching and mentorship that you received. How does someone who is fresh out of school, fresh out of UCLA, how do they go about seeking that mentorship? How did it work for you and what advice would you give to them?
Sure. Well, actually, I was undergrad at Penn and started off my career actually on the East Coast. And UCLA was business school. We'll talk about that a little bit more about why I ultimately chose to go back to business school. But at least in those early days of my career, I sought out the teachers. And I think you could figure that out pretty quickly in your career that there are some, if you will, supervisors or managers
Hmm.
who are impatient and just want to get the work done.
Hmm.
And then there's others who are willing to invest the time to point out mistakes that you've made, to not just criticize, but to give really constructive criticism. And I remember it was on a project I was working for UPMC Health System, and a partner uh, pulled me aside and said, Jonathan, I happened to listen in on your presentation, and it was some relatively insignificant presentation, but I saw some things that I thought were interesting. And if you'd be open to it, I'd be happy to share some feedback of things you could do better. Now, I guess I could have run from that and dreaded, oh gosh, he's going to reprimand me. But I welcomed that invitation. I sat down for dinner one on one with a partner, and he was fairly critical. You could have done this better. This didn't work. What you said, you stammered. There were
Wow.
content suggestions. There were just feedback delivery suggestions. But he said, hey, if you're open to this, I'd be happy to sit down with you again next month and share some more ideas because I see something in you. I think if we could work on this, you could rise fast. Ultimately, he helped me get promoted. guidance and coaching really positioned me in my first promotion, and it was something that I always think about and something I'd like to try to help other people do, and I've always sought out opportunities to mentor and coach others throughout my career. Ironically, he also helped me figure out many years later, the same individual helped me figure out many years later that consulting was no longer the right function for me and that I should look elsewhere and look for other jobs, which has opened up so many new possibilities for me. It was fascinating to see how he helped me chart not just progression within that company, but helped me bring to fruition that I actually wanted to leave consulting and do other things.
Wow. It sounds like this person, ended up being a mentor, a coach, and a sponsor, all three in one. So you got the trifecta there. It was really cool that you had this person, to help guide you. Is this person responsible for your eventually attending business school at UCLA?
In a way, yeah. See, I came to him with some concerns that I had started selling business. I had advanced, had been promoted twice in consulting, and I had
Mhm.
started to sell projects and generate revenue, and I was getting these national roles, and it was exciting. But I shared with him that I felt like when we would, if you will, descend upon a client, we would work on site with these clients. We would sell work to the senior executives, and then they would introduce us to their teams, and those teams were always defensive. There was this tension. And what I realized is so much of what I was advising executive teams on were actually post merger integration, where maybe two hospitals or hospital systems had been merged. And I had helped identify that there were redundancies within certain functions. And I was going to help the management team uh, integrate these businesses. Maybe the workflow processes were different between the different systems and to try to help figure out best of breed. And there was this tension and this frustration from amongst the people I was trying to work with and help. And I realized sometimes these companies didn't belong together. And I was just helping to force these businesses together. And I thought, gosh, wouldn't it be great if I could help create better marriages?
Yeah,
Wouldn't it be great
that's
if
what
I
I
could be
was
involved?
thinking. This sounds like
Yeah,
you're a
a lot of what
matchmaker.
I was doing, like marriage counseling, if you
Yeah.
will. And so this mentor said, gosh, maybe what you really want to do is to put these companies together initially and share some of this consultative strategy work on the front end,
You mean like
not
before they
post merger.
merge? Like,
Yeah.
okay.
And so he said, have you ever thought about investment banking? Because in that function, you help bring companies together. You are that advisor talking to the C-suite executives about whether it makes sense to combine. Does it
Right.
make sense to sell to a private equity partner? Does it make sense to sell
Right.
to one of your biggest competitors? And I realized I just have no idea how to do that. And that helped me realize that even though in my consulting career, for example, I knew everything about how to optimize accounts receivable process wise, I didn't know where to find it on the financial statements. And I didn't understand anything about how uh, changes in accounts receivable, for example, may change the value of a business. I didn't understand how any of the levers around profitability could drive the attractiveness of a company. And I realized I needed to go back to business school and learn a lot more finance and accounting fundamentals, a lot more strategy. And so I went back, I applied to business school, I got into UCLA Anderson and went back with the intention of finding a way into investment banking.
So was UCLA, were you already in LA and that's why you applied to UCLA from the East Coast, or, what was your, how did you
Yeah.
get to the West Coast?
Well, my my wife grew up in LA. I grew up in New Orleans. I met my wife in college in Philly at Penn, and she had said many years earlier that ultimately we're making our way back to LA. There wasn't much of a choice there, and so
Nice.
yeah, in my career during my consulting career, I moved from New York out to LA. So I was
Okay.
already situated here in LA and trying to figure out what would be the best program for me. And uh, was fortunate to apply and get into both USC and UCLA, and I chose UCLA Anderson. I thought it was the best fit for me,
You chose
schedule
well.
wise, philosophy wise. Yeah, I'm very happy with it.
That's
And so,
fantastic.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I also participated in not just a lot of the prep, the finance and accounting prep work and coursework, but I also did a lot of the on-campus recruiting, which is what got me access. It opened up the door to introduce me to brand name, New York-based investment banks that had dedicated healthcare practices. All I've ever done in my career is work with healthcare companies, and so I actually got 3 offers out of the on-campus recruiting and was able to choose the firm that I wanted. I went to a firm called Cowan, or then it was called Cowan and Company, and my wife agreed for a brief period to move back to New York just so I could have the classic Wall Street banking experience, as long as I agreed to ultimately make our way back to LA someday in the future.
That's awesome. Okay, so you went back to New York for a few years, and then you came back to LA, and your wife is happy and you're happy, and you have 2 kids as well.
Yeah.
So I want to talk a
Well,
little bit about your family, because I think it's so fantastic, that you're able to, have this when people talk about work-life balance, a lot of times they refer to women having to juggle the kids. But, when we were trying to schedule this call, you were like, hey, I'm picking up my daughter from a sporting event, and you go to the sporting events and you've got 2 teenage kids. So tell me how you juggle being in a very powerful, busy position that you're in, and still, a good dad.
well, it's hard and it's always a work in process. I try to juggle and balance and share with my wife, and some months I do a better job of it than others. And look, I might have to be on the road sometimes 2, 3, 4 days a week. That's not every month,
Right.
but some in my line of business, when my client needs me, I have to go
Hmm.
wherever it is and whenever it is. I've tried to figure out ways to juggle and balance. And one of the tough choices that we made pretty early on in my investment banking career, my wife said that I'm going to plan what I think makes the most sense for our family to do. We are going to try to work around your availability, but when it comes time to go to the event, we're going to go. And if that means, Jonathan, you have to stay behind so you can finish your call, we don't want to interrupt your call, do it, but we also don't want to sit around waiting for you to finish. Sometimes a call will take forever. Sometimes I'll have to cut a vacation short to go to a meeting. But we realize we don't want my family to miss out on the opportunity to do what they want to do. And in uh, to counterbalance that, when I am home and I don't have a conflict on my schedule, if I can raise my hand to do a pickup, to do a drop off, I will. If I can schedule a call around those obligations so that I can try to take some of the load off my wife and be present for these important events for my kids, I'm going to do it if I can. Now, that might mean me having to stay up until 2, 3 o'clock in the morning sometimes to make sure that I finish my work. But I have that flexibility to move, if you will, the chess pieces around and try to still be present for my kids and to try to help facilitate letting them do the things that they want to do, and ideally to be able to have those full family events where we're all together as often as possible. But as I said, it's a work in process. Some months are better than other months.
I love that you used chess as an analogy. I want to build on that for people that want to follow in Jonathan's footsteps and learn how to, be a managing director of a major M&A firm. What advice would you give to, folks that are graduating from UCLA Anderson class of 2023? What advice would you give to them, as they plan their career trajectory on how do they, become the next Jonathan Bluth?
Oh, well, believe it or not, the most important advice is something that the head of healthcare at Cowan, Peter Reiches, had given me pretty early on in my associate tenure in investment banking. He had said something along the lines of, I know that you are driven and determined to do as much as you can, as fast as you can, but slow down. And before you send any email, whatever it is, stop and redirect your attention to something else. you're going to race to get that email done as quickly as you can, to respond to your client as quickly as possible, to respond to me as quickly as possible. I love that about you, but pause and stop, so that when you take another look back at that email, you're not only going to identify spelling errors, typos, but you might pick up on tonal concerns that you may not have seen in the initial drafting of the email. So he had made some comment to me. He said, I never send an email as soon as I write it. I will always pause and do something else. It could be early in the morning and there's an urgent thing that has to get out. He said, I'll take a break, I'll shave, and then I'll finish the email, or whatever it might be. I might have my cup of coffee and then come back to the email. Because sometimes taking that 5 minutes to take a break, to reset, allows you to see something different, that allows your message and your intent to be delivered more effectively, and allows you to accomplish your goals, believe it or not, in a shorter amount of time, if you're more effective in the initial drafting of an email. And so it's an interesting piece of feedback that has been so important to me in my career. And I think it's important for all folks to recognize that if you're going to advance investment banking, you have to be fast, you have to be comprehensive, you have to be accurate. But sometimes it's helpful to take just a minute to slow down, to make sure you're thinking things through correctly.
I think that is phenomenal advice for, any aspect of the professional world, but definitely in what you do, Jonathan. Would you talk a little bit about, some of the challenges that you've experienced and how you would, advise someone who's working their way up the career ladder to overcome those challenges? Like, what's been a really tough moment for you?
Well, gosh, there's been
a lot of them.
There's been a lot of interesting challenges.
Well, how about we talk about maybe like during COVID when you weren't traveling, maybe you could talk a little bit about how you were still able to maintain the relationships when you weren't there in person, and how you had to forge some of them virtually.
Well, thank God I was blessed to have good health, and those around me had good health during what was such a scary time. I think, like many people, we figured out how to transition to connect and engage with our clients virtually, and our prospects and our colleagues. It's funny, something that I was just thinking, maybe your earlier question though, Sumita, as we think about advancing, I think it's important as you work your way up in your career to think about how each job and role that each project that you work on can add to your narrative and your story. So that's whether it's virtually or in person. I think if you can, as a rising employee, whether it's in banking or consultant, if you could think about how can this experience help me share my story better, whether it's with a prospective employer for future career progression, or whether it is with a prospective client to try to win some business, to be able to articulate your value add, your contribution, how you've overcome some of your obstacles is really important.
And I like the way you phrase that, because it is a personal narrative, and it goes to what they teach us at UCLA Anderson about having your personal brand.
Yeah.
So what would you say is Jonathan's personal brand?
I'm a nice investment banker.
You are the nicest banker I've met.
It's interesting that there's a lot of folks I've met in my career in banking and finance who are just jerks, and I don't understand why they go out of their way to be so obnoxious.
Because they got to live up to the stereotype.
So there was a transaction that I'd worked on many years ago. It was one of the first deals I worked on back at Cowen, and I don't want to get into many of the specifics, but I'll share that I felt that we had a client who chose to go in a direction without a complete set of information I just felt that they weren't fully informed about all of, there's a term we use sometimes in banking about strategic alternatives. Maybe
Okay.
I, I don't feel like this particular client was educated about every one of their options. And I was very early on in my career and I didn't
Mhm.
know why we as a team, why my superiors weren't educating the client on those options. And in the reality, it's possible that there were, behind the scenes one-on-one calls that I wasn't privy to, where the senior bankers were talking to the executive team about these options. But from my perspective, as a relatively junior banker, I didn't see it. But what I saw was the management team just reject what was a great offer on the table. What I knew from what I actually learned in business school, I learned about what should theoretically be determined as a fair offer, and yet this manager team walked away from it. And it was only a few months later that uh, the stock price of this company cratered. Most of the leadership team, if not all of the leadership team, lost their jobs. And I just thought, gosh, I wish that they could have known more. I was confident they would have chosen to proceed differently with some of these options that were in front of them at the time, that it could have saved the company, could have saved their careers. That singular moment shaped me in determining that I was going to do whatever I could to try to help guide my clients, not push them to sell, not push them to do anything in a rush, but I was going to make sure that they were educated about their options, that they came out of their transaction process fully appreciating the different levers, the different options, and making the most informed decision possible. And I hope that my brand, it's not just that I'm a nice investment banker, but that after completing a transaction working with me, that my clients and frankly my teams that I work with, that they feel that they had a holistic process. They explore their options. They're pushing forward, that they can sleep well at night knowing that they made the best decision based on the best possible set of facts that could have been available to them at that time.
Okay, I'm going to repeat some of what you said back because there were so many wonderful gems in there. So I want to highlight the ones that stuck out to me as a, non-investment banker. So one of the bright lights there was that you want to be a trusted advisor to your clients. Another one was you want to be able to give your client the full buffet of options and give the candid picture of pros and cons for each option. And so they have all the strategic alternatives that you're talking about. And then finally, you want them to understand, whatever they commit to, the ramifications of those decisions. What would you highlight
That's
anything
it.
else?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's great.
Yeah, it's pretty profound. So it sounds I don't want to keep digging into the marriage analogy, but it does sound like you're a wonderful matchmaker because at the end of the day, it is about making sure that there is a successful union of these two entities, and it's only going to happen. I mean, ultimately, business is about people, right? So it's only going to happen if the two people that are making the deal trust one another. And so it's your job, Jonathan, to foster that environment of trust. Am I understanding it correctly?
Yeah, that's true. I just, and speaking of trust, uh, and maybe this is another tip for folks that are earlier in their careers. When you complete the transaction, that shouldn't be the end of your relationship with your client. In many cases, it should be the beginning of a lifelong relationship. If you do your job well, you should retain those clients as friends. I mean, as
Mhm.
contacts, and to be able to stay close to them. And just yesterday, I caught up with a former client. We had coffee, and he was telling me how he was so grateful that I helped him with eyes wide open know what situation he was getting into with the buyer of his business. That he understood the dynamics of the executive team and their investor, of the team that was buying his business, because it's helped him navigate, it's helped him be successful working in a much larger business. And he was talking about how his wife had shared that she was grateful that I had shared these kind of insights, that it wasn't just a financial transaction. And by the way, as we were leaving coffee and he shows me his brand new Porsche, he's like, and by the way, the financials were great. It was like, oh yeah. But
So that was a win.
yeah, but I think maintaining those relationships, and the only way you can do that is if you really are honest and transparent with your clients, and that they go into a transaction knowing exactly what they're about to get themselves into. I think if you can, as wherever you are in your career, as in sort of any client service position, not just banking, right? If you can be fair and honest with your clients, and then they should be very, and you deliver the product that you said you would deliver, then you should be able to maintain a long-standing relationship with those folks for years to come, which is very rewarding.
I think that's a beautiful place to end. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us, Jonathan. And I just want to recap real quickly for the folks that maybe were listening to this on 2X. The 3 key takeaways that I got from our conversation. Number 1, you don't know where your path is going to take you, but be very deliberate if you have a destination in mind so that you can build that narrative, that career narrative. Number 2, seek out mentors. If they don't seek you out, you seek them out. And then 3, relationships. Can't say enough about relationships. That's something that UCLA Anderson taught us extensively, but it needs to be used effectively in business, in life, in everything that we do. Because at the end of the day, the transaction is one aspect of it, but humanizing the people behind the deal is extremely important for your brand. What else would you add to that, Jonathan?
Sumita, you're really good at this. That's what I would add. You're really good at
I
the
told you we'd
questions you've
have fun.
asked. Yeah, this has been fun, and I'm looking forward to hearing this, and hopefully we can do more interviews like this with more alums, and continue sharing some of the collective knowledge of UCLA Anderson Healthcare.
This is great. Thank you so much for talking with us today.
Thank you.